Good afternoon, everyone. Librarian Danielle Bélanger here from the Cote-Saint-Luc Public Library, joining you virtually. Today, we have another great program for you. The library is thrilled to have the opportunity to host a conversation with 2023 Scotiabank Giller Prize finalist, Dionne Irving. Thank you very much, Dionne, for taking the time to speak with me all
Thank you
the
for
way,
having me.
thank you, from Indiana. Thank you also to Andreas at Paragraph Bookstore for helping us get the word out about this event. If you're a library member, you can put your name down on our wait list, the islands. To begin, I'll share a condensed bio. Dionne Irving is originally from Toronto, Ontario. She is the author of Quint and the Islands in 2022. Her work has appeared in Story, Boulevard, Lit Hub, Missouri Review, and New Delta Review, among other journals and magazines. Irving teaches in the Creative Writing Program and the Initiative on Race and Resilience at the University of Notre Dame. Congratulations, Dionne, on a beautifully curated collection of award-nominated short stories. I'm referring, of course, to The Islands, which you just saw a moment ago. This collection of short stories was shortlisted for the 2023 Scotiabank Giller Prize, was also a finalist for the 2023 Penn Faulkner Award for Fiction, a Hurston Wright Legacy Award nominee, longlisted for the 2023 New American Voices Award, and a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. I'll share a brief glimpse of what's been said about the islands to give you an idea of what to expect. Powerful stories that explore the legacy of colonialism and issues of race, immigration, sexual discrimination, and class in the lives of Jamaican women across London, Panama, France, Jamaica, Florida, and more. The Islands follows the lives of Jamaican women, immigrants, or the descendants of immigrants who have relocated all over the world to escape the ghosts of colonialism on what they call the island. Set in the United States, Jamaica, and Europe, these international stories examine the lives of an uncertain and unsettled cast of characters. Set in locations and times ranging from 1950s London to 1960s Panama to modern-day New Jersey, Dionne Irving reveals the intricacies and assimilations in this debut collection of short stories, establishing a new and unforgettable voice in Caribbean American literature. Restless, displaced, and disconnected, these characters try to ground themselves, to grow where they find themselves planted in a world in which the tension between what's said and unsaid can bend the soul. So Dionne, can you tell us a little bit more about why this collection came about and why it was important for you to publish it in this format?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. In some ways, the collection's a culmination of work that happened over a really long period of time. I started writing some of these stories over almost 20 years ago at this point. And I kind of wrote them a little bit at a time, and that I was writing them sort of thinking I wasn't always sure that these are stories that people would want to read. There are stories about people who are living either in liminal spaces or in marginalized communities. And I just didn't know that those were stories that would appeal to readers. So I was writing them, not even so much for publication, but because they felt like important stories to me to tell. And so, they really kind of came together a little bit at a time in terms of thinking about what stories were important to me about immigration and what stories were important to me about what it meant to be a part of a global diasporic community. I'm sorry. Bird sounds.
Thank you. Prior to the publication of this short story collection, The Islands, your debut novel was Quint, a fictionalized version of the Dionne quintuplets. Can you please tell us why you chose to tackle the story of the Dionne quintuplets? I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with this word right now.
It's a story, that I think, like a lot of Canadians, that I knew about for a really long time. And to me, when I think it was like John and Kate plus eight that was on TV, where there was again this family of multiple births, and it felt to me sort of like history repeating itself, in that there was this sort of branding and commodification around family. And, that show probably came out over 20 years ago at this point. But in fact, I think the culture has sort of gotten worse in some ways, that like there are mommy bloggers and influencers now. And, I was just seeing one of them's been tried, was convicted last night, and so it's interesting the culture actually has gotten worse about that stuff, right? This idea of like the personal family unit as brand, as a part of like this cog in the wheel of capitalism, right? Which to me sort of had really larger ramifications of the ways in which like capitalism doesn't allow for a family in the way that we like to think it does, if we think about family as being something that you can sell, and children as being product. And so that those themes to me were always really resonant. And even though it's a story that's set in the past, it felt very, very contemporary to me. And in some ways has gotten even more contemporary since I started thinking about those ideas, because it's become an even more pervasive part of our culture. And I think that the long-term effects of that obviously were horrible for the Dionne quintuplets. And I worry too about some of the children now who, their family is the product, and everything from their, first moments potty training, to being accepted to college, are all sort of documented on Instagram or Facebook or on the family blog. That's a real invasion of privacy that the child doesn't ask for.
Can you tell us how the experience with both your writing approach and editing for Quint and the Islands differed?
Yeah, they're very different books in a lot of ways. I had really fantastic editors with both books. I got really, really lucky in that way. I worked with Hasantha Sirancina at 713 Books and with Lee Newman at Catapult Books. And both of them were really just fantastic editors. And I think one of the things for me that was so wonderful about working with each of those women was that I felt like they really understood what I was trying to do with those books. And I think that's really important in the editorial relationship, right? It's not so much about like fixing a book, right? But the idea of how do we amplify this thing that you're trying to do and make it really sing. And so I think one of the things for me, I think I am at heart a short story writer, not a novelist, even though I'm working on a novel again now. In that, like, a novel's a lot to like sort of keep in your head, and I wrote Quint over a really long period of time. And for me, that process of writing that novel really meant that my life was kind of changing, as I was working on the novel. During the time I was writing Quint, I became a mother, and that really changed a lot of things about the book. So it was a real like evolution of process. And so I wasn't the same person or the same writer I was when I finished Quint as when I started Quint. And I think that's the thing with a novel, it is, for me, I'm a very slow writer, a very labor intensive process. The novel I'm working on now, I'm about 6 years into it. And so, I'm hoping this is the year, right? I want it to be faster than I did Quint. But I think that that for me has been the hard thing about novel writing, is that, I change so much as I'm working on these novels a little bit at a time, that it changes sort of the shape and the scope of the book and what you're wanting and hoping to do.
In the Islands, the shortest story included is Shop Girl. Despite it being only a few pages long, I feel you packed quite a punch with this one, and we really get a sense of the character's mindset and struggles. Can you tell us a little bit more about this one in particular?
Yeah, it's really funny to me. It's the shortest story in the book because in many ways it's the story that encapsulates the book itself. I grew up in my parents' Caribbean grocery store, and that was a place where I heard a lot of stories. And I always wanted to write about that, but I wasn't quite sure how to do it. And because it was such a big experience, right? And so, how do you take that big experience and turn it into something narrative? And in some ways, actually, the short form and the compression actually helped me make a better story, because it allowed me to do some things that wouldn't be able to happen time wise in a novel or a short story, because they require a kind of unpacking that a flash piece doesn't. And that, I was able to actually work in some of those things that are intangible and more linked to things like sense memory, that came pretty naturally in the compressed form of a flash piece.
Without giving too much away, here's an extra glimpse about what you're in store for when reading The Islands. In Florida Lives, a woman and her husband impulsively leave San Francisco and move to Florida with wild dreams of American reinvention, only to unearth the cracks in their marriage. In Some People, the only Jamaican mother at a prep school feels pressure to volunteer in the school's International Day. In Waking Life, a travel writer finally connects with the mother who once abandoned her. I've come across people who have said your writing was sassy. Do you agree?
I don't know what that means, actually. I mean, it's hard, it's funny because I think that I would like my writing to have like a kind of levity in it. And for me, that levity in writing is really important, right? And I talk to my students about this when I teach, and that, like, I sometimes talk about it within the context of humor, but I think sometimes levity is a better way to talk about it. In that, if there's too much that's too heavy in a story, I think it can feel imbalanced, right? And I think sometimes then it can sort of tilt into the direction of melodrama. And I actually think that doesn't allow us to have a kind of full emotional reaction, right? I think it is actually the levity paired with kind of the heavy thing that allows us to sort of feel those feelings so intensely and so fully. So for me, it's always sort of trying to figure out what that balance is going to be on the page. How am I going to make sure we understand the seriousness or the weight of a moment, but how are we going to underpin that with a kind of levity that's not going to make it feel too heavy?
In terms of the stories themselves, is there a particular story you enjoyed writing the most, and why?
I will tell you the story that sort of I enjoyed writing, but it's changed a lot. Some people, when I wrote the initial draft of that story, the main character was a stand-up comedian, and I'd done all this research on stand-up comedy, and I'd written jokes. She had like a good tight 5 in the middle of the story, and my editor read it, and she's like, "I really love this story. But this character is not funny at all, like not even a little bit." I was just like, got it. I was like, I worked so hard on those jokes. And so, I had to kind of change that. But it was like, I was really like, yeah, she's going to be a stand-up comedian. She's going to tell all these really funny jokes. And it wasn't working. So I don't have a career as a comedy writer, I guess, in my future. So.
There are 10 stories featured in The Islands, but I did hear somewhere that 5 additional stories were edited out. How was that decision made? And will we be able to read those 5 other stories in a different format?
Maybe. I don't know yet. But you know what? They were good stories to take out of the collection. In that, I think as a writer who had not put together a short story collection, even though I'd read a lot of short story collections, it's kind of one of those things that you learn by doing, right? I didn't understand sort of the ways the story collections that I loved the most had a kind of natural arc to them, right? That they started someplace, and that by the end of the collection, they took you someplace else. And I don't know that I had like organized the collection in its initial way that did that. And I think one of the things that was really wonderful about my editor is she really immediately saw what I was trying to do as an arc, and that like maybe wasn't working completely, and kind of moved some of those things around. And so she took the stories she took out of the collection were stories that weren't benefiting that arc, or just kind of took us in a different direction. So maybe related to kind of some of the thematic ideas of the collection. But again, I think really the best short story collections I love so much, I'm thinking of something like June Lahiri's Interpretive Maladies, or Laurie Moore's Self-Help. Those collections have a real arc to them, that they do start in a certain place and take you to someplace different by the end of them. And I think that's why they have such great resonance. I think that we often don't think about story collections as having that kind of arc. And I heard Roxane Gay say this once in a talk, but she said, you know, a story collection shouldn't be like your greatest hits album, right? Like it's not just, you're not just putting everything you really love in that collection. And I think poets understand that kind of, you know, very intimately because of the idea of what a poetry collection is as a whole. But it was something I had to learn and figure out kind of how to do. And in working with my editor to see how she reorganized the collection and taken some of those things out, the second she just, you know, she sent me the list of table of contents, like maybe this is how we should kind of think about organizing it. And I saw it right away. I was like, yes, this absolutely tells the story that I want to tell in the islands, about, you know, liminality and isolation and alienation. And that we start at Florida Lives and end with another story with life in the title, I think is not lost on me, and that it does, you know, and we go from, yeah, that full arc of story.
In this short story collection, there's a common theme of displacement, otherness, as well as the notion of intersectionality. Can you speak a little more on this?
Yeah, I mean, for me, writing is essentially an intersectional endeavor. I think that it's both intersectional and interdisciplinary, in that I feel like good writing really asks us to think about the human experience, right? Which is what both, I think, intersectionality and interdisciplinarity ask us to do, right? Not just one aspect of the human experience, but the human experience in total. But I also think that's the kind of thing that moves us, right? So fundamentally, you know, there's something really rooted in us as a species to gravitate towards narrative, right? And we forget that there's narrative embedded in all aspects of life. I often say some of my favorite students that I love having in class are bio majors, because there's something about biology majors that understand storytelling, because the body is a story, right? The body tells a story. And that's part of being a doctor, being a researcher, right? Is like uncovering what that story, you know, tells, what story the body is telling us, right? And that's kind of what literary critics do too, right? They're uncovering what's on the page and what is it telling us and what is it revealing to us about our humanity. And so for me, that idea of, you know, how intersectionality works in this story is that, like, I don't think it would be a full story unless it was about being a woman, but also being a Black woman, but also being, you know, an immigrant, that all of those things coexist in a singular person. And none of us is one thing, right? All of us are made up of multiplicities. And so to say, well, it just has to be about this or that, you know, I think does a disservice, you know, to the stories. And I think one of the things that's true in the collection is that in some of the stories, like you see, like the immigration piece really foregrounded, even though there's other things. And in some it's, you know, love relationships being foregrounded. And in some it's about work being foregrounded. And so there's all different things, you know, but those other things are still coexisting, even though one might be foregrounded a little bit more in those stories.
The characters in these stories have been said to be complex, and some without being able to recognize their complexity. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, but isn't that most humans, right? We're not able to recognize our complexity, right? That's the human experience, you know. I mean, I think that, like, you think about something like, you know, the deathbed confession as a cultural trope, right? I mean, it's just that, right? You get to the end of life and you know, maybe there's an epiphanic moment, right? You see God and you understand everything. Suddenly things become clear. I also think that, you know, we all have a sense of ourselves, right, that is probably not mirrored in any way, shape, or form, right? That, you know, your friends might see something that's close to your sense of self, or it might be very different, right? And so I think that navigation is going on always for us as people, you know, what we think of ourselves and what's true about what's reflected outward. So I see for me a lot of these characters struggling with not having the benefit of hindsight, or not having the benefit of completely understanding the long-term ramifications of their actions in that particular moment, as none of us do, right? I mean, we all make choices, good, bad, and otherwise, and don't understand how they're going to turn out always, right? And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But that's the beautiful, beautiful messiness of life.
Yes. I've heard you say you were surprised that people would want to read and are reading The Islands. For many of us who will have read this powerful collection of short stories, it is a perplexing thought. Can you elaborate as to why you would think that people would not be interested in such stories?
I think because they felt so personal to me. Like, they felt like stories about my culture and my community, and I wasn't always sure that those would have a larger readership beyond, you know, people who are maybe interested in that. Um, which, you know, I think is a combination of things, right? I think it's a combination of, you know, maybe not seeing the ways in which, you know, literature about characters who were either marginalized or you know, not who lacked privilege, you know, as not being the kinds of books or the kind of literature that was being, you know, celebrated, right? And that was, I would say that that was a message I got in a lot of instances from a lot of places, right? That you know, what kinds of stories are these? Who would want to read these stories? You know, why are you writing about this? And so I think that, you know, in thinking about who would want to read these stories, which is this weird thing that's very separate, right, from art and art creation. It's a publication question, and so kind of like I said earlier, you know, for me, a lot of the writing of these stories was for me stories I wanted to read at first, you know, and so, you know, I wasn't sure who else might want to read them, and so it's been really just amazingly gratifying to see that these stories resonate with other people, and that they have meaning for other people, and they're powerful for other people. That's meant so much to me.
Can you please share the story of how The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz inspired you?
Yeah, I mean, I just don't know that I had read that many stories, you know, about the diaspora that came from the point of view of a character who wasn't born in that country, right? You know, a lot of what I got, I think, early in my education about Caribbean lit was like Jamaica Kincaid, read Jamaica Kincaid, read A Small Place, you know, read Lucy. And I love Jamaica Kincaid, and she's an amazing writer. But that was very different than my experience of the Caribbean, which was coming at it from a diasporic lens. And so for me, thinking about those stories as valuable and important, I just didn't necessarily feel like there was, not that there were not any stories about it at all, but, you know, in the large celebrated cultural way, right? Where Oscar Wilde won the Pulitzer, it was that book that was everywhere the year it came out. Junot Diaz was everywhere the year that it came out. And the book is actually, you know, very experimental in a lot of ways. It brings in the fantastical, it brings in the mystical. And so he was doing all of these things. And to me, that offered legitimacy, I think, not just for myself, but for a lot of other writers of color, to say, like, oh, we can write about our culture, we can write about our community, and it doesn't have to be sanitized or put through the lens of, you know, just what a kind of white Western perspective on literature would be.
So there are a few instances here where you wrote on sexual exploitation or microaggressions. Can you talk a little bit about how you went about integrating those strains in certain of your stories?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I was just chatting with another Canadian friend who lives in the US, and I think that one of the things that is interesting is living in the US and having a life here. It's not that there are no microaggressions in Canada, but they're so pervasive here sometimes that I don't even always realize it, right, until I come back to Canada, and things are very different there, right? And so it is not, of course, that Canada is a magical or perfect place. It is not. But to me, I also realized how much of a way of life that is for a lot of people of color, that you live in a space where every day is this kind of battlefield that you move through, and that you don't even always realize it, right? Because it's life. And it's not until you're in a space where you don't feel that you realize how much of your life it takes up. And so I think for me, that was like very important to thread into the collection in terms of thinking about not as making a piece where it had to be an issue piece and it's a piece about microaggressions, right? But thinking about the ways that I wanted to make those sort of a part of those characters' lived experiences.
So we've had other guests interviewed whose books became television series. I was wondering if this is something that is being considered, because I definitely could picture episodes.
Yes, me too. There's not been any movement on that yet, but
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if you saw the anthology series that Steve McQueen did in the UK, Small Acts, which I just absolutely loved. That was all these Caribbean stories in London, and I love the idea of like a short story anthology series. I would love that. So, and I would love for Canadian television to broadcast it. So, if you know anyone who, there hasn't been any pickup of it yet, but I just, I mean, it's my own work, so it's like my child, and I love it. But but I would love to see it as an anthology television series. I think it would be really,
Yes.
really cool. So
do I. So do I. So can you tell us a little bit about the writing process? Because short stories are sort of like vignettes of, part of a story without the whole story. So how do you go about writing for a short story collection versus for your novels?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually it's probably why my novel writing takes so long, is that, I have to, start writing them more like novels and less like short stories. That my short story writing process is really kind of writing these little sections kind of one at a time. And for me, with a short story, right, it often starts with like kind of a germ of an idea, and I'm sort of building out from there. And regrettably, my novels also work the same way. And so they're like puzzle pieces I'm trying to put together. I think because of that, and one of the reasons that I am kind of a slow writer, is that sometimes I will have either an idea of a scene or a moment that I'm working out from. And so, I know a lot of writers like plot and plan out. I wish I was one of those writers and not. I'm very much, flying by the seat of my pants. But it's often like sort of trying to, make my way through the dark, look for the light switch. There's been times, and this happened both with Quint and I think with my recent novel, where the ending came to me. And so that's somewhat helpful in that I'm writing towards that ending. So I think I wrote the ending to Quint like year 5 or 6. And same with my new novel. I think I wrote the ending like year 3 or 4. And so I'm writing towards that thing, but I'm not even always certain how I'm getting there. And so why that I knew that was the ending, I don't know. But like I knew, like when it came, I knew. And so for me, it's a very, very patchwork, very, very messy process. I think with stories, to me, they're a little bit more line by line maybe than a novel is. I feel like because of the scope of the novel, you're always kind of pushing towards that big thing. And for me, because stories are less about maybe the car crash, kind of plot, that I'm moving towards, that it's thinking about what's that incremental thing that I'm trying to get towards. And so a lot of that, I think, in a story happens on a sentence level. And I really, I have a lot of friends that are poets, and I love poets so much. And I think that, I really fixate on language, maybe too much, but that sort of tinkering at the sentence level in the story, and that the story kind of, I think, gives you space to do in a different way than the novel, really appeals to me.
Often audience members are interested in hearing how a writer approaches writing. Do you have a certain schedule for your writing or routine that you follow?
Oh man, I wish I did. I really wish I did. My life is kind of chaotic in that I have a young son. I teach at Notre Dame. I, am chauffeuring him around to various activities, and doing all of those things. And so it's just catch as catch can, where I can do it, how I can do it. And so sometimes it's, in the pickup line on the way to school, and sometimes it's like between meetings in my office, and sometimes it's, while he's swimming at swim practice. So like wherever I can do it, I
do. And do you use storyboards?
Don't. I am, quite honestly, I don't know how these books get done. I'm the sloppiest, worst writer. I have gone back to writing longhand, and I write in notebooks. I wish it was just one. That would make sense, but it's like 6 of them. So there's pieces of the story all over the place, and then when I write on the computer, there's pieces there too. And sometimes it's on Post-its that like are stuck to my computer and inside my notebook, and then I sort of gather up all this stuff and start inputting it, and it's extremely messy. It is not a good way to work. And I know so many other writers who swear by Scrivener or storyboarding or have a very regimented. I would love to do that, but I don't know. I can't. And I do think for me too, there is something about sort of sitting at the computer and typing that I think can actually feel sterile. I know for some people that actually works better because it's like a job, right? And while writing is work, I guess I don't like the sterility of just sitting in front of my keyboard and having to feel like, all right, I've got to do it. Because there's something a little pressury about that too. It's like, I've got 4 hours and I've got to produce this many words, and especially when, like I said, I'm often like in the dark trying to figure out what's going on. And so sometimes that means, staring out the window for 20 minutes or taking a walk and just thinking about things. And so, I was talking to another writer recently, and she was telling me, her daughter was talking about her career day when she was growing up, and the daughter was like, yeah, I don't know what she does. She just sits and stares out the window in her office. And I love that anecdote, because it was like, yeah, you're actually working then, but it doesn't look like work.
Dionne, I'm going to allow the audience now to chime in with their questions as well. So if you have a question for Dionne, please put it in the chat and I will read it out to Dionne. In the meantime, I believe I heard that you are working on a very ambitious novel about climate change and how this leads to losing culture, pieces of culture. Can you just talk a little bit about this? If you're allowed, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you kind of some of the impetus for the novel for me came from some research that I was doing from climate scientists who were talking a little bit about how climate change is linked to the transatlantic slave trade. And one of the things that scientists now are saying is that once the transatlantic slave trade happened, that like there was sort of no going back for us with climate change, like of course the Industrial Revolution and those things were not great for adding to the problem, but like the problem started there, right? And that once that started there, it couldn't be undone. It was too much movement in the Atlantic. There had never been anything like that in human history. That many bodies, that much movement, that it warmed the water far too much. And what really struck me about that statement was that people who live in the global South, people who were deeply impacted by the transatlantic slave trade, people, on the continent of Africa, in the Caribbean, in Southeast Asia, were going to be the people who were affected first by climate change and who historically suffered most at the hands of that transatlantic slave trade. And so for me, that was really poignant in terms of thinking about what that meant, because colonialism and slavery both were responsible for eradicating culture in large ways. And one of the things I think is interesting is the way that the result of colonialism and slavery, that new cultures and new languages and new things were born out of that, right? Which speaks to a kind of resilience, and that erasure was going to happen again because of the same kind of action. And so that story felt really, really powerful to me. That kind of dual erasure and the dual consequences of that, through no fault of the people who inhabit those regions. That to me felt like there was a story there.
Okay, I see a question has appeared from Andrew Nickel. Hi there. I know you said that you didn't have a set writing schedule, but is there anything that you've done which was helpful in terms of writing regularly?
I mean, for me, it was school. I mean, I think that in terms of thinking about the difference between artistic practice for my own pleasure versus like how to become an artist in a more professional capacity, that's for me was part of the kind of habits of mind that going to school gave me. And I hear that a lot from young writers. Well, should I get an MFA? Should I get, a PhD? And in some ways, that's a really personal question. And that, for some people, I think maybe they don't need that, right? Maybe those things will come without it. But I also think it's really hard. And I think there's lots of distractions in this world. And I think that for me, having both those degrees, where not only did I learn sort of habits of mind in terms of writing, but also thinking about the really wide world of literature that it opened me up to, as well as a different way of thinking about literature. That those things for me were really, really valuable in terms of my own artistic practice. I know that's not for everyone, but that's really the things that kind of helped me professionalize, I will say, as an artist. Not just the credential aspect of it, right? Because I think for some people, they feel like it's just the credential, but it's what I learned in both those degrees that helped me in terms of that professionalization aspect.
So we have heard from a few authors in the past that they get together with writing friends and sort of bounce ideas off of each other. Is that something that you do as well when you have the time to do so?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think that having a community of writers is really important. I am sort of without writing group at the moment, which has been kind of tough. But I think just sometimes even talking things through with people and sort of sharing ideas with them and saying like, is this something that's interesting, or is this kind of a crazy fluke in terms of an idea? But I will say that is probably not my first step in the process, even having that conversation. I'm usually like writing a little bit and thinking, about things a little bit. I remember I was at a writing conference several years ago with a friend, and I kind of had this idea for an essay, and I wrote a little bit. And then I said, can I just read you these 2 paragraphs that I wrote? And is this interesting to you? And, she was like, yes, I'm really, really interested in that. Keep writing it. And that was really kind of all the encouragement I needed in terms of finishing that essay, to go like, is this something interesting, or is this just, me shouting into the void? So
I like how you said earlier that the first story and the last story sort of they have some kind of commonality and you're closing the loop and you come full circle. Is this something that you try to do as well when writing a novel?
I don't think that novels for me have to have that circular quality. I think they can. Um, I don't know that Quint did, but I would say that my new novel probably does a little bit more. Um, I think that novels can do a couple of things. They can be speak to kind of a larger cultural and thematic idea just in their existence, right? And they usually do. But I don't think narratively they have to kind of have that sort of closure. I also think that, and this is something I say to my students a lot, there's a real difference between ending and resolution, right? That you can have an ending that doesn't offer a resolution, right? That you've established some kind of conflict within the course of a story or a novel, and that there's going to be an end to the actions or events, but that doesn't mean that the conflict is resolved, right? And that those two things are really, really different ideas to think about. And so that we have to think about how a story is resolved versus how it ends, right? Because I think the half-life of novels is that they do go on, right? Ideally, beyond the world goes on beyond the end of the story, right? Or where the story comes to a resolution. And that part of, for me, novels that I like best are those ones where I can kind of, I could gaze out into the landscape and see the sort of the difference that's coming in the future, but it doesn't have to be on the page.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dionne. This is the only
Yeah.
question that I received from the audience, and I think that I've asked you many, many questions. So we wish you all the best,
Thank you.
and really happy to see the success that the Islands is getting, especially for a short story collection, because this is not always a format that people pick up, but I would encourage everyone at the library to put their name down for the Islands. And thank you so much, Dionne, for joining us and for sharing some of your insights on writing this.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.